Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells, and I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and I talk about games on the internet. Today, I get to talk about one of my all-time favorites, The One Ring. We're going to look at the book of Erebor. Erebor is the Lonely Mountain. That is the dwarf kingdom that Bilbo helped to return to the dwarves in The Hobbit. That whole story is them going to the kingdom of Erebor. And the basic time setting of the One Ring role-playing game is in between The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And so it takes place about 5 years, or starts, ideally, 5 years after the Battle of Five Armies. And so Erebor is once again a big, thriving kingdom during this period. King Dane, if you remember the movie, and I don't necessarily want you to remember the movie, but if you do, the big, huge dwarf king that shows up riding on a pig and he's got red hair, King Dane, played by Billy Connolly, that's him. He is the one who's in charge of the kingdom under the mountain of Erebor. And so this is primarily a setting book. It is designed to give you lots of information about that kingdom, about some of the other kingdoms, like the Iron Hills, which is where Dane used to be before they killed Smaug and got the Lonely Mountain back, and a few of the other areas that are around there. So let's take a look at it real quick. Now, the PDF that I'm using defaults to massive close-up in-your-face view every time I click a bookmark. So, for example, when I click a bookmark right here, blah, then you get it right in your face, and it's just enormous. So here you can see the map. And you can't see it super huge, but anyway, right in the middle is the Lonely Mountain. Over here on the left side is Mirkwood, and in fact you can see the Elven King Halls right here. And then there's this river, that's the river that Bilbo and the dwarves were on when they were in barrels. And then up here, just off of the map, is the Grey Mountains. And this is all, like, there used to be a kingdom of dwarves in the Grey Mountains as well, and this book talks about those. But they're not on this particular map, because this is an Erebor map. And then down here are the upper marches, and then down here where you can't see are the lower marches, and then way down here that's currently off your screen altogether is where Dorwinion would be. And Dorwinion's kind of an interesting little thing. Way over here off the side is where the Iron Hills would be. Anyway, this is... let's take a look at Erebor first. So it gives this map... I find this map to be a largely useless map, actually, because it doesn't actually show you where things are in relation to each other, because the kingdom is so three-dimensional. You go in the main doors here. This is the town of Dale, and this is the river that comes out and then curves around like that. So there's Dale, which is a human kingdom, and there's a lot of information about Dale in this book. A ton, and it's great. And then right here, there's the big gate, and then there's, you know, some various other things, and then there's, you know, whatever. You don't actually know where this stuff is in relationship to each other, because this is more of a pretty picture than a map. But anyway, you can see how big the kingdom is. And what's interesting to me as well, you don't see this much in The Hobbit, but what Dane has done, now that he's in charge, is he's asked some people to start building on top of the mountain. And so there are a lot of things on the top of the mountain as well, including several big watchtowers. So there's a kingdom under the mountain, but there's also, it has some stuff on top of the mountain as well. Now, as you go through here, it's going to give you lots and lots of information about what is, you know, what's there, and then stats for who you're going to find there. So the people who watch the gate are called the Stone Guard. There's their stats. Don't fight them, because you will lose. Then, you know, what is it the council like? The Iron Guard. It talks about the upper halls, the lower halls. Some interesting things like the Great Hall of Thrain, for example. This is where... am I thinking of the right one? Yeah. So the Great Hall of Thrain, they consider to be haunted, and it's essentially empty. They don't let people into it. I mean, they do, but they don't use it for anything. It's mostly just when you're passing from one region to another, because of all the dragon sickness that is still in there. They've taken all the treasure out. This is where Smaug used to live, but Smaug was there for hundreds of years, and kind of classic Tolkienian magic system, his influence is still there. And people who hang out in the same room where he used to be, they can hear that call of dragon sickness, which is basically greed. So it talks about smiths, it talks about the vast door, it talks about different things you can do. Go see the tomb of Thorin, and so on and so on. Lots of neat things you can do here. Then it goes into actual stats. It gives descriptions and stats for Dane Ironfoot, gives stats for Roak the Raven, and then it gives most of the surviving members of Thorin's company, and it gives them full stats. And so if you want to use them, and there's nice bits of advice on how to use them in your campaign, if you want to use them, you can. Of particular note here is Balin the Statesman. He is the one who, you know from Lord of the Rings, decides he wants to reclaim Moria. 5 years after the Battle of Five Armies, he's just kind of sort of getting to that as an idea. And so one thing that might be fun for you to do as a campaign with your group is to join Balin's company and go try to retake Moria. Well, here's Balin, and there's some stats for him, and there's things like that. So there's a lot of neat stuff you can do with all this information. One thing that I did not point out, I skipped it, is there's a whole, right up super close. There is a history of Erebor section, and this is very long, and it goes all the way back. The game takes place, if you do the Battle of Five Armies thing, then the game takes place in 2947. So this is almost 1,000 years before that, when Erebor was founded. And it goes through the whole history. There is a lot of neat ideas in here. None of it is obviously stuff you can necessarily just use whole cloth. If you want to, take some of these early ideas and say, you know what, we're not going to set our game in between Hobbit and Fellowship. We're going to set it 1,000 years in the past. We're going to show the founding of Erebor, or we're going to show, one of the many times that people tried to destroy Erebor. You can, and this give you some advice for that. Anyway, so let's talk about one of the other neat things that this book has. Super close up. It talks about treasure. First of all, it talks about different kinds of treasure. And so there are Nogrod and Belagost are two ancient dwarven holds. And then, of course, there's Khazad-dûm, which is the dwarf word for Moria. And so there are things you can do if you want to have treasure that comes from those dwarven kingdoms, like somebody finds an old axe or an old suit of armor or whatever, it is going to have special qualities. And there's already other special qualities in the game, in particular if you get the Rivendell book. But here are more of them. And later on in this book, they have full, let's see if we can find it right here, Dwarven Smithing. Full rules for your dwarf characters to craft their own incredibly powerful weapons. And this is the kind of thing that might take several years of their life. But there's some really cool rules in here, rules for how they become obsessed with what they're creating, different rules for how they can enchant what they are creating, and in the classic style of the One Ring role-playing game. It's all very flavorful, and it's all very quick. It's a pretty smooth, neat little system that's handled as a Fellowship phase undertaking. So that is really neat, and I like it a lot. Then, super close up, we get to talk about Dale, which is the human kingdom right outside of Erebor. It is not under the control of Dane, King Under the Mountain, but they are very close partners, and he does offer them protection. And so it is as close as you can be without actually being part of the kingdom. The city gets a lot of description. There's not actually... So we get this full map, and what's kind of fun about this is that, as you can see, Dale, whereas Lake Town is actually set up on like struts and stilts in the lake, Dale is on land, but it has canals running all through it. And so this is, in contrast to the Lonely Mountain map that I think is mostly just there to be pretty, this map is incredibly useful. And it has lots of neat sites. It has these 23 different areas, and there's lots of information on what Dale is like. If you want to make someone from Dale, You don't need new rules. There's no new human cultures in here. There's just new dwarf cultures. If you want to make a man or woman of Dale, you can just use the barding rules from the core rulebook, and that works totally great for you. So, yay, talk about Dale, but then it talks about the surrounding areas. And by the way, when we talk about Dale, there's a lot of things you can do in Dale as well. There's new undertakings, there's new people to meet, there's lots of stuff. We won't go into that. Okay, so here's the other Gray Mountains. So just like the other setting books, and we've looked at some of them before, like Heart of the Wild and things like that, this book describes each region in pretty good detail. So these are the northern Dale lands. Okay, this is a pretty peaceful human-controlled kingdom right next to the woodland realm of the elves and the dwarven kingdom under the mountain. And so it's relatively peaceful and relatively prosperous. There's a lot of trade. It's easy to travel in. What is it like? So it has descriptions, it has the wildlife, it has people who are there, and then it's got these kind of notable people, including Garrick of the Black Arrow, who's like a kind of a Robin Hoody terrorist character that would be fun for you to use. And then it has some intriguing, places. So in just 3 or so pages per area, it gives a lot of useful stuff. And then it does the same for the waste. This is, the desolation of Smaug that has not gotten back to normal again. This is still mostly just absolute wasteland, and there's still some pretty interesting things to do in it, which is awesome. And then we have the Gray Mountains up here, and what are those like, and what do you want to visit there? One of the really fancy things is this place of Beinharn is an old dwarven kingdom that was never huge, but because they didn't have gold, they were a poor kingdom in life. But the plus side of that is that the dwarves, the dragons never came and attacked them because dragons can smell gold. They didn't smell any gold in Beinharn, so a lot of the things that they did have, like stonework and other metalwork, non-precious metals, and of course records and archives and libraries, those are all still there. And so those are some neat things that you can maybe send your characters to go and do. We have the upper marches here. This is Erebor right there on the left. And then over here on the right is the Iron Hills. So this is where Dane currently rules, and this is where Dane's son currently rules, although as a vassal state of Erebor. And so the upper marches is a nice peaceful area in between them. Big open field with a lot of stuff to do. Down below that, we have the nether marches. And the nether marches is kind of interesting in that it's kind of like the upper marches, but it's more barren. And so it's a little more peaceful to travel in, maybe, but you're not gonna find any good stuff or bad stuff. It's much more empty, it's much more wildernessy than a lot of the other places are. It's got this neat little haunted woods here. It's got 2 important towns. This is also getting pretty far east. Nobody in the books ever actually traveled this far east, other than mentioning, hey, we came from the Iron Hills. None of our point of view characters ever went this far east. Now, if you follow this river all the way down, it is going to get to Dorwinion. Dorwinion is fascinating, and it's so far down it's not even actually on the map. It's not close enough to Erebor to be included in this book, but it does get mentioned because it's interesting. Dorwinion is the furthest east free people's settlement that I guess we could say never fell to the shadow. So whereas the Easterlings, the Haradrim, those kind of things, they sided with Sauron in the war in Lord of the Rings, Dorwinion didn't. And Dorwinion is famous, even in The Hobbit it gets mentioned, because all of the wine that the elf kings were drinking came from Dorwinion. The barrels that the dwarves hid in were headed back to Dorwinion. And so there's a very brief description of Dorwinion here in the book as a place that you can travel down that river and go see. They're very famous for their wine. It's a strong enough wine that it can get even elves drunk, is like the one thing we know about it. And so anyway, I like Dorwinion a lot, and I'm a fan of it, so you get to hear about it. Oh, that's also Alduna, um, or not Alduna herself. They talk a little bit about some characters from Dorwinion, but Una, King Bard from Laketown, who now is the king of Dale, and that's where the Bardings get their name from. He is married to a woman of Dorwinion named Una. Um, the book has kind of styled Dorwinion a little bit on like the Roma people. They're not, they're more settled than we would think of classic Roma traveling around in wagons. Although the Easterlings were known as the Wain Riders and the Wagon Riders way back in history. So it's a nice way of bringing just some different cultures that we don't often see in Lord of the Rings, but are there canonically. It's a nice way to bring them into your game. Anyway, then there's a huge section here on dragons, and this is the last thing I want to make sure to talk about, because this big section on dragons talks about the wars that they've had in the past. There's a pretty big description of the war between the dwarves and the orcs, which gets a lot of mention in the books, but happened, 100, 200 years before, so we don't actually see it. And there's rules here on how to create your own dragon. If you want to make your own dragon to add in as an antagonist, there's different kinds. Basically, cold drakes, fire drakes, and long worms are how they are defined. Smaug was a fire drake. And then there's different rules. And each decision is going to change how tough they are. Smaug was an old dragon, and so he's, got all of these extra powers, and he's really amazing and impressive. And then you can give them all of these neat abilities, and you can basically build a big, cool dragon that will take your characters possibly several years of adventuring before they finally get to the point where they can even find it and try to fight it, let alone actually kill it. Dragons, as we know from Smaug, are big, huge boss antagonists. They're not the kind of thing that you just kind of fight while you're on your way somewhere else. It needs to be the culmination of a great big thing. And they lean into it in this book. They really give dragons the weight and the import that they deserve as major villains and major evils in your game world. And then, there's some treasures that you can get from dragons. There's treasures you can get to slay dragons. There's a couple of rules on specific dragons that are still canonically around. And then, of course, we get, well, here's the Dwarf and Orc War. And I want to just skip through. I recommend anyone who plays the One Ring get the Adventurer's Companion, because it is a really good tool for adding in all of these extra cultures to the game. So, for example, this book has Dwarves of the Iron Hills and Dwarves of the Grey Mountains as character options, and it gives full options for them. Everything that you would find in the core book about the Dwarves of the Lonely Mountain, you can find in here. All the starting scores, the different backgrounds you get to choose from, the virtues and the rewards, and then again the same thing for the Grey Mountains. Every setting book adds one or two new player cultures as options. And so, if you don't have the wherewithal to go out and buy every setting book to make sure you get the one thing you want, you can just grab the Adventurer's Companion, and then you have all of that, because it collects every single culture from all of these setting books and just puts them into one place. It's a nice option for players as well. As a player, you don't necessarily need the Erebor book because it is mostly Game Master info. But if you want to play a Grey Mountain Dwarf, then you've got the Adventurer's Companion, and that will let you do it. So anyway, it adds a couple of new prefab characters in here, just as, two different dwarfs, and that's the whole book. I really love this game. I say it every time. It's one of my favorites. It's a smooth playing game. It's a lot of fun. I think you will enjoy it a lot. And if you want to play dwarves of any kind, then Erebor is a really good resource for you, because it tells you, things to do, how to create your own smithing weapons, because dwarves love crafting, how to do all of that stuff. It's a good resource. It's a good book. It has a lot of fun adventure, and there is a adventure book connected to it called The Laughter of Dragons that uses all of this setting stuff we've talked about and pulls it in. Anyway, thank you for watching this. I hope you have loved it, and I hope that you take a chance to go and play some of these games because they're super cool. Anyway, you're awesome. I will see you on my next review.